enactment of public reaction every time the pump price of premium motor spirits, PMS, increases. The Nigerian public space has been thrown into turmoil over the latest hike in price. The new price range from 850 naira a litre at Nigeria National Petroleum Company Limited owned filling stations to 1,200 naira a litre at stations owned by independent marketers. The public reaction to a new petrol price regime has been the trend. This public reaction to new petrol price regime has been the trend since 1988. As always, the government is the culprit of the new price regime. The price intervention policy was first conceived and implemented in 1973 to offer cheap petrol to the public due to an oil increase crisis in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. That was when the Organization of Arab Oil Exporting Countries, the precursor of the oil producing and export countries, OPEC, collectively embargoed the supply of crude oil to the United States of America and began a series of production cuts. These cuts nearly quadrupled the oil prices from $2.90 a barrel before the embargo to $11.65 in January 1974. The ensuing rise in oil price sent shockwaves worldwide, and the cost of petroleum products, especially the famous petrol brand, skyrocketed. To lessen the impact of the petrol price increase on Nigerians, the government, under the leadership of then General Yakubu Gowon, announced the policy of subsidizing petrol price. The subsidy is occasioned by fixing the product price, usually below the market price, and paying the difference between market and the fixed price. Since that 1973 intervention, we have been stuck with the vagaries of subsidies. Of course, many countries across the world initiated different subsidy mechanisms to the high petroleum products price increase. At that time, the Nigerian government subsidy intervention was rationalized by the enormous earnings from the crude oil price increase of more than 400%, which left the country more or less flush with petrol dollar. It was a convenient policy of simply giving a small proportion of the revenue to cushion the impact of the price increase on the Nigerian poor at that time. General Olusegun Obasanjo, then military head of state, also formalized the petroleum subsidy regime into law when he numbered it among products for which the government will be responsible for fixing their prices and for which they should not be sold above the fixed prices. Again, this was supposed to be a short-term measure to cushion the rising international oil price. It was intended as a temporary fiscal measure, as a temporary fiscal response to an oil price hike instigated by the actions of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, at that time. That was in 1977. It is, however, instructive to note that under the two principal protagonists of subsidy, the price of petrol recorded increments in response to emerging economic realities. Under Gowon, for example, the price increased by 40% from 6 kobo a litre to 9 kobo a litre, while under Obasanjo, it skyrocketed by 70% from 9 kobo a litre to 15.3 kobo a litre. Our argument is that subsidies were introduced into the Nigerian economic ecosystem as a consequence of the availability of fiscal resources. They were then a mechanism for fairer redistribution of the country's wealth among the populace in time of huge revenue earnings. When there is a downturn, the tendency is to halt their implementation because of the distortion inherent in their continued application. But as it were, the subsidy and we, as a people, have become economic Siamese twins. Every move by the government to stop its application since 1988 has been received with uproar and outrage, despite the material changes in the economic dynamics that inform the policy in the first place. This latest furor over fuel price increase is typical of other times. The Nigerian Labour Congress has taken its traditional front row and as always pointing fingers at the federal government for being responsible for the latest price increase. However, as a body of analysts, we submit that all this trouble mongering should stop. Despite the common knowledge that fuel subsidies were excluded from the second half of the 2023 budget, about 73% of Nigerians interviewed in an opinion poll said they were dissatisfied with the removal. Nonetheless, this does not detract from the fact that fuel subsidies have become Nigeria's equivalent of an economic weapon of mass destruction. The narration often shows how subsidies have strangulated the Nigerian nation's potentials, and burnt up 30 billion that can be funneled into other uses, such as infrastructure, health, and education. In 2022 alone, $10 billion was spent on fuel subsidies, representing 40% of the country's total revenue. The petrol supply scenario was also exacerbated by the annual $28 billion taken from the critical foreign reserve to import fuel into Nigeria. This is in addition to the 1 trillion naira the country had to borrow to finance fuel subsidies in Nigeria in 2022. A further examination of the subsidy regime shows that households in the bottom 40% of the income distribution account for less than 3% of fuel purchases at the pump. According to a survey by a private firms, public transportation services, government agencies, and other businesses consume three-quarters of all fuel sold in Nigeria. Most vehicles used, meanwhile, most vehicles used for carrying large numbers of people and goods are diesel powered and are already deregulated. Also, household kerosene, which people with low incomes mainly use, is no longer subsidized, meaning that people with low income are already to a large extent paying market prices for their own type of fuel and energy. This means the government mainly subsidizes those who can afford fuel at the market rate. So whose interest is the NLC advancing? We are in a new era, aptly thematized as the Petroleum Industry Act era, PIA era. Regarding the subsidy regime, Section 5E of the PIA 2021 empowers the NNPCL, that's the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, with the sole mandate to provide pricing and tariff frameworks for natural gas in midstream, and downstream gas operations and petroleum products based on the fair market value of the applicable products. Similarly, Section 215 of the PIA also emphatically stated that the dynamics of market forces should determine the price of petroleum products for the NNPCL. These are the letters of the PIA, the law regulating the petroleum industry, not President Tinubu's reference summary dismissal of the subsidy regime in his 29th May 2023 inauguration address. We find it surprising, however, that the same people who want full adherence to the provisions of the PIA and clamor for it are the same individuals who want the president to subvert the law. To avoid doubt, it will amount to a breach of the law for the president, government, or even any of its agencies to attempt to determine the price of locally produced fuel, even when the Port Harcourt refinery begins to roll out fuel, whenever the first phase of the ongoing rehabilitation is concluded. It will still have to sell the product at a market-determined rate as a commercial entity. Anything other than this will amount to interference from the authorities and a return to subsidy, especially if the price has to be lower than the market rates. We dare to submit that we subscribe to the doctrine and practice of a liberal free market economy, in which private capital and investments compete favorably to drive social economic development as championed by President Tinubu. Surprisingly, the NLC is exhibiting a doomsday disposition in this matter. We therefore call on the NLC and indeed all Nigerians to eschew this traditional resistance to market-determined pricing. We assert that this pricing principle is a route to fully developing the country's mainstream and downstream sector, and thereby enabling Nigeria's long-forgotten petrochemical industry, which is a major employer of labor and a veritable source of raw materials, to flourish. This is the larger extension of Nigeria's growing potential to become the petroleum refining hub of the West African region. If the NLC must protest, it should be concerned with driving this vision, the vision of making Nigeria the dominant refining hub in Africa, driven by the private sector. The labor movement should also be focused on compelling the federal government to speedily roll out the adoption of compressed natural gas, CNG, an energy source that has been confirmed to be cleaner, vehicle-friendly, and way cheaper than petrol. Meanwhile, without the NLC agitation, we are witnessing what the government is doing in the health sector with the National Health Workforce Policy to transform Nigeria's healthcare and reintegrate the hospital professional into health sector, into the healthcare sector. We consider this a social revolution by its standard. In connection with this, and to the applause of the Nigerian Medical Association, the federal government has already started implementing the medical residency training fund, which is in full swing. This is enabled by savings made from scrapping fuel subsidies. And of course, if you all remember, most times resident doctors have gone on strike. It had always, one of the major principal demands had always been their training fund, as provided here. Our appeal to labor and all Nigerians of good conscience is to actively engage the government in changing internally resources that would have been funneled into the renewal subsidy regime to developing the health sector, the educational sector, and providing functional infrastructure that makes businesses grow. Difficult as it appears at this moment, we can assert that only market-determined petrol pricing can unlock the true but latent potentials, capacity, and capabilities of the Nigerian nation and its people. Gentlemen of the press, this is the crux of the matter. Thank you for listening.